Somewhere in the
Oh
American South,
my
hidden beneath
God.
layers of forgotten history and dusty agricultural records, sits the story of a food so powerful that it sustained entire civilizations, kept enslaved people alive through unimaginable hardship, and provided more nutrition per plant than almost anything growing in fields today. Yet today, most Americans have never heard of it. They walk past it in markets, if they see it at all. Scientists have studied it for decades, confirming what our ancestors knew all along. But the food industry has quietly pushed it aside, replaced it with cheaper alternatives, and erased it from our collective memory. This is the story of American agriculture's greatest loss, a food that fed nations and vanished from our plates without a sound. What is this mysterious crop, and why did a nation of people decide to forget it ever existed? The story begins not with abundance, but with hunger. When the earliest settlers arrived in what would become the United States, they brought their own foods, their own seeds, and their own ideas about what the land should produce. But the land had other plans. Winters were harsher than anyone expected. The soil behaved differently than in Europe. Crops that had sustained families for generations simply did not thrive in this new climate. The first colonists faced starvation not once, but repeatedly. They watched their children grow weak. They watched their numbers dwindle. And then they learned to look at what was already growing here, what had been growing here for thousands of years before their ships ever arrived. Native peoples of North America had developed farming techniques refined over centuries, and they grew crops that were perfectly adapted to this land, crops that stored well through brutal winters, crops that packed incredible nutrition into every seed and leaf. One of these crops, in particular, would become the hidden foundation of early American survival. It was a legume, a plant that grew in the soil and somehow made the soil better, not worse. It produced protein in a world where meat was scarce and uncertain. It grew in conditions where other plants failed, and it became so essential to survival that colonial records mention it constantly, though the modern reader barely recognizes its importance. Historians would later realize that without this crop, the early colonies would have collapsed entirely. Without it, there would have been no sustained European settlement in North America. Yet today, almost no one knows it was ever important at all. The plant thrived in the hot summers of the southern colonies, where plantation owners began to see its potential. They grew it alongside tobacco, alongside cotton, alongside other crops that would make fortunes. But this crop was different. It was nutritionally dense. It replenished the soil instead of depleting it. It could be dried and stored for months without spoiling. And it kept people alive. As the plantation system grew and demand for enslaved labor increased, plantation owners relied on this crop to feed the people they enslaved. It was cheap to grow. It required minimal processing. It packed calories and protein into small packages. Plantation records from the 1700s and 1800s show that enslaved people received rations that relied heavily on this food. It appears in bills of sale, in daily records, in the documentation of what people ate. The irony is deeply painful. This crop, which the colonists learned about from native peoples, which sustained the enslaved people forced to build America, which proved itself to be one of the most nutritionally complete foods available, became a food of poverty and slavery. It became associated with suffering and desperation, and that association would follow it into the future, eventually erasing it from respectable society entirely. Wealthy planters grew it to feed enslaved workers because it was economical, not because they valued it. As America developed and became wealthier, the people who could afford to move away from this food did so, and they did it quickly. They saw it as the food of the poor, the food of the enslaved, the food of desperation. They wanted something else. They wanted to forget. And so, one of the most nutrient-dense foods ever known began its slow disappearance from American plates. Somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, something remarkable happened. Scientists began studying the nutritional content of foods in systematic ways they had never done before. They had testing equipment. They had databases. They could measure proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and compounds that scientists hadn't even known existed a generation earlier. And when they began analyzing this forgotten crop, they discovered something astonishing. The plant was one of the most nutritionally dense foods that could be grown. It contained complete proteins, containing all 9 amino acids the human body needs. It was rich in fiber, minerals, and compounds with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. It stored well because of compounds that prevented spoilage. It was low in calories, but high in satiety, meaning it kept people feeling full. It actually helped prevent certain diseases. The data was remarkable, and it kept getting better. Study after study confirmed that this food deserved a place at the center of human nutrition. Researchers in different countries, working independently, reached the same conclusions. The food that had been abandoned as poor, outdated, and inefficient was actually a nutritional superstar. Publications began to appear. Scientists wrote papers highlighting the benefits. Nutritionists started recommending it, but something strange happened. While the scientific world documented these findings carefully, the general public never heard about them. The food industry didn't promote the research. Food companies had already invested in other products. Marketing machines that could sell processed foods with glossy ads and celebrity endorsements showed no interest in a crop that required knowledge and tradition. The crop didn't have a corporate owner. No company had invested in making it profitable and modern. There was no money in making people remember something that used to be free or cheap. So the scientific revolution that should have brought this food back to prominence simply didn't penetrate popular consciousness. A few health enthusiasts knew about it. Nutritionists mentioned it to interested patients. But the average person shopping in a grocery store, the children being educated in schools, the families sitting down to dinner, they never heard the news. The greatest nutritional discovery of modern times, or at least the rediscovery of something ancient that science had now validated, went largely unnoticed by the people who could have benefited most. Researchers published findings that proved this food could help solve modern health problems. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and many cancers are connected to poor nutrition. This crop could help address these issues. But the information remained, trapped in academic journals and specialized publications. A mother trying to feed her family healthy food on a budget would never find this information in mainstream media. A person trying to prevent disease would never hear about it from their doctor because the medical system doesn't prioritize nutrition in the way it should. The scientific validation of what our ancestors knew had become one of modern society's best-kept secrets. The disappearance of this food from American culture wasn't an accident. It was the result of choices. Some of those choices were made consciously. Others were made unconsciously, simply following the path that seemed most profitable or modern. But together, they resulted in the erasure of something precious. The psychological weight of slavery and poverty hung over this crop like a shadow. Foods become associated with the people who eat them and the circumstances under which they eat them. This crop had been the food of enslaved people. In a nation struggling with its racial history, there was a powerful incentive to forget foods associated with that history. Wealthy white Americans had moved away from this crop when they could afford to. And as America became wealthier overall, more people had the option to do the same. Eating certain foods became a marker of status. In the hierarchy of prestige, this crop fell to the bottom. It became something poor people ate because they had no choice. It became something associated with regions of the country that wealthy, educated Americans felt superior to. It became a punchline in jokes about rural, unsophisticated, backward places. The crop was pushed aside by modernization and industrial agriculture that prioritized profit over nutrition or cultural preservation. Chemical companies had invested heavily in fertilizers and pesticides. They needed farmers to abandon crop rotation and traditional methods. They created marketing campaigns around modern agriculture. They funded agricultural schools and influenced what young farmers learned. The old ways, including growing this crop, became associated with ignorance and backwardness. Scientific progress, as they defined it, meant doing things in new industrial ways, using chemicals and machines. Education systems stopped teaching about traditional agriculture. Cookbooks focused on modern recipes using modern ingredients. Schools removed this food from cafeteria menus. Television and media promoted processed foods and modern convenience. Seed companies, consolidating into larger and larger corporations, made business decisions that didn't include maintaining varieties of traditional crops. A farmer who wanted to grow this food couldn't easily find seeds. They couldn't find buyers. The infrastructure that supported growing it had disappeared. Slowly, knowledge of how to grow it and how to cook it became something only held by older people, usually in specific regions. When those people died, the knowledge often died with them. Young people moved to cities. They ate differently. They didn't learn their grandparents' recipes. They didn't maintain their grandparents' gardens. The cultural transmission of this food broke down. What had been common knowledge, something every person of a certain age would know, became specialized knowledge held by a decreasing number of people. In less than 2 generations, something that had been essential to human survival and universal to American culture became nearly unknown. Today, this crop sits at a crossroads between erasure and revival. Small groups of people know about it. Farmers in certain communities still grow it. Heritage gardeners maintain traditional varieties. Food historians document its importance. Scientists continue validating its nutritional benefits. But it remains largely absent from American tables and completely absent from the mainstream food system. The potential for return exists. Climate change is making modern agriculture increasingly difficult. Monoculture farming systems are proving less resilient and less sustainable. Soil is degrading around the world. Chemical inputs are becoming more expensive and more restricted. People are becoming more interested in understanding where their food comes from and how their food choices affect their health and their communities. All of these factors could create an opening for this crop to return. Indigenous communities that never fully abandoned it and are helping others remember. Chefs interested in food traditions and heritage cooking are seeking out recipes and techniques. Farmers interested in sustainable agriculture are discovering that growing this crop can help restore their soil while producing nutritious food. Small restaurants and local markets are beginning to feature it again. Scientists are conducting new research on how this crop might help address modern health crises. Every piece of evidence suggests that this food deserves to be important again. And yet, the barriers to its return remain substantial. The food industry is built around other crops and other products. Convenience and speed are deeply valued in modern culture. The psychological associations with poverty and slavery still linger. Industrial agriculture is powerful and resistant to change. Marketing budgets for healthy traditional foods cannot compete with marketing for processed foods. A person walking into a grocery store will still find little or no availability of this crop in most places. A person looking for recipes online will still struggle to find reliable information. A child growing up in America today will likely reach adulthood never having tasted this food, never having known its importance. The question is not whether this crop is worth returning to. The science is clear. The history is clear. The nutritional data is overwhelming. The question is whether modern society has the will to remember something it has tried so hard to forget. It requires a shift in how we think about food, about heritage, about tradition, and about justice. It requires recognizing that moving forward doesn't always mean leaving the past behind. Sometimes moving forward means recovering wisdom we lost. Sometimes healing means remembering. Sometimes the future looks most promising when we reach back and gather the gifts our ancestors left for us. This crop stands waiting. It grows easily. It stores well. It nourishes thoroughly. It heals soil. It connects us to history and to each other. The question now is whether enough people will notice, Remember and choose to bring it back.